Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I have a habit of reading municipal documents that most people would find either boring or inexplicable, and I've never been able to fully explain it myself beyond the fact that local governance reveals things about a place that no other document does. Zoning ordinances and water rights disputes and the minutes of planning board meetings from 30 years ago tell you what a community actually values, what it's actually afraid of, what it's organized itself around in ways that the Chamber of Commerce brochure won't mention. I moved to Vell for a job that let me work remotely from anywhere, and had chosen Vell specifically because it was small and quiet and affordable and within a reasonable drive of a city when I needed one. And within the first week of settling in, I downloaded the town's municipal code from the county website and started reading it the way other people read local news. The ordinance was in Chapter 14, between a section on noise complaints and a section on the maintenance of public green spaces. It was titled Curfew Provisions for Non-Resident Presences, and it ran to about 400 words, which is brief for a municipal ordinance and precise in a way that municipal ordinances rarely are, as though whoever had written it had known exactly what they were describing and had chosen their language with specific care. The ordinance established a curfew period running from 2 in the morning until 4 in the morning, during which time non-resident presences were prohibited from occupying any street, sidewalk, public space, or the exterior grounds of any private property within the town limits of Vell. The ordinance defined non-resident presence as any entity that does not hold permanent residency within the municipality, and that is not classifiable under standard categories of human, animal, or mechanical presence. It listed enforcement mechanisms that were vague in ways the rest of the ordinance wasn't, referencing existing agreements rather than specific procedures, which suggested the enforcement was something other than a police matter. I read it 3 times. Then I read the sections around it to confirm I hadn't misunderstood the context. Then I looked for any legislative history, any meeting minutes that referenced the ordinance's passage or amendment, and found the record of a town council meeting from many decades ago in which the ordinance had been formalized from what the minutes described as existing community practice into official municipal code, with no debate recorded and a unanimous vote. I asked my landlord about it the following Saturday, framing it as general curiosity about local regulations. She was a Vell native in her 60s named Petra, who managed several rental properties in town and who had a specific quality of warmth that had clear limits. The warmth of someone who will help you with what you need and has decided what you need doesn't include certain information. She confirmed the ordinance was real and on the books and taken seriously, said the 2 to 4 window was something long-time residents just built into their routines, and redirected the conversation toward the practical matters of my tenancy with a smoothness that suggested practice. I tried the general store owner, a man named Dalt, who had the loose, unhurried quality of someone whose conversational life had become the primary entertainment of his days, and who I'd found was good for local background on most topics. He was less evasive than Petra, but not more illuminating, confirming the curfew, confirming that most people in Vell treated it as you'd treat any local ordinance. You follow it, you don't make a big deal of it, and you don't stay out in the 2 to 4 window without good reason. I asked what good reason looked like, and he said there wasn't one really, and changed the subject. The third person I tried was the town clerk, a woman named Orvine Sech, who had held the position for 30 years and who had the specific institutional knowledge of a long-time municipal employee, the deep familiarity with the place's formal and informal workings that accumulates over decades in the same chair. I made an appointment, which felt slightly formal for what I was asking, but Orvine turned out to prefer formal, receiving me in her office with the pleasant efficiency of someone who has learned to manage what comes through her door. She told me more than anyone else had, in the careful, measured way of someone who had done this before with other newcomers and had developed a version of the explanation that gave enough to satisfy without giving more than she considered necessary. She said the non-resident presences had been part of Vell's environment since before the town's founding, a feature of the local geography, the way the river and the ridge were features of the local geography, and that the relationship between the town and the presences had been managed in various ways across the town's history, not always successfully, before arriving at the current arrangement. She described the early history obliquely, referencing incidents in the town's first decades that the formal record documented without fully describing, and she said the curfew had emerged from those incidents as the most workable solution to a situation that wasn't going away and couldn't be resolved through more direct means. I asked what the presences were. She said that in 30 years of managing the municipal record on this topic, she'd arrived at the position that what they were mattered less than what they did and what the town's relationship to them required, and that she'd found this position more useful than any of the alternative frameworks she'd considered. She said it with the specific serenity of someone who has had a long time to make peace with something. I asked what they did. She said they moved through the town on a cycle that the town had learned to anticipate, during hours that the curfew now codified, and that their movement through occupied space produced effects on the people in that space that the town had determined were better avoided through the simple expedient of everyone being indoors with lights off during the window. She said effects the way a doctor sees side effects with the clinical precision of someone describing something they've assessed and categorized rather than something they're still processing. I thanked her and went home and thought about what she'd said for the rest of the afternoon. I observed the curfew behavior over the following 2 weeks before I did anything else. Watched the town from my windows between 1 and 4 in the morning on several nights, noting what happened. Long-time residents had a routine around it that had the ease of long practice. Lights in houses went off in a graduated pattern starting around 1:30. Not all at once, but in a sequence that moved through the residential streets in a wave, suggesting either a collective, implicit timing or something more organized that I hadn't been told about. By 1:45, the town had a quality of deliberate quiet that was different from the incidental quiet of ordinary sleeping hours, the specific settled darkness of a community that has withdrawn from its own streets on purpose. The streets during the window were empty in a way that ordinary late-night hours don't produce in a town of any size. Not just low traffic, not just quiet, empty in the way of a space that has been cleared for a specific purpose. I stayed up through the curfew window on a Thursday night in my third week in Vel. I want to be honest that I'd been advised against this in every conversation I'd had about the ordinance, not explicitly. Nobody had said, don't observe the curfew window, but the implicit structure of every conversation had pointed toward it. The careful limits on information, the consistent redirecting, the way Orvine had said, better avoid it. I stayed up anyway because I had come to understand enough to want to understand the rest, and because I thought controlled observation through a window was different from being outside, which I had the sense to know was not something I was going to do. They came through around 2:30. I'm going to describe what I saw as accurately as I can, which means I'm going to fail to describe it adequately, because what I saw during that curfew window was something for which the available descriptive vocabulary is imprecise in ways that matter. Not because it was impossible to look at, not because it was visually dramatic, but because what I was observing didn't behave the way visible things behave, present in a way that the eye registered and the mind handled in some secondary processing channel rather than the primary one, the way you process something in peripheral vision that you can't quite bring into focus when you look directly at it. They moved through the street in front of my house. Multiple, I thought, though number was difficult to determine because the quality of presence they had made individual boundaries hard to establish. They moved with a pace that had no urgency in it. Not slow exactly, but unhurried, in a way that suggested this transit was something they'd made many times and would make many more, through the streets of a town that had organized its overnight hours around their passage. Nothing about their movement was threatening in any direct or immediate sense. They weren't moving towards houses or toward anything I could identify as a target. They were moving through the transit of something following a route, and the route happened to pass through Vel's residential streets during a 2-hour window that the town had established a curfew around, and that I was watching from behind a darkened window on a Thursday night because I'd been in town 3 weeks and couldn't help myself. One of them stopped, outside my window, directly outside, in the street in front of the house, at a point that put it approximately 20 feet from the window I was watching through. It stopped with the quality of something that had registered a change in its environment and was addressing the change, which was me, which was the fact of being observed by someone who hadn't turned off their lights and gone to bed at the appropriate hour. I did not move. I want to be clear that not moving was not a decision I made with any particular clarity of thought. My body made the decision, and my thinking caught up to it, a moment later, arrived at the same conclusion through reasoning that my body had arrived at through something faster and more reliable than reasoning. It stayed outside my window for a period I estimated at about 15 minutes, but cannot confirm because I'd stopped checking time at some point after it stopped and before it moved on. 15 minutes of proximity between me and something that the town of Vel had been managing through municipal ordinance for generations, something that had no category in any framework I'd been given, that the town clerk had declined to name, and that the local store owner had redirected conversations away from, and that my landlord had acknowledged and moved past with practiced smoothness. It moved on when the 4 o'clock hour came. Not precisely at 4, not to the minute, but within a few minutes of 4. With the same unhurried quality it had arrived with, continuing whatever transit I'd interrupted by observing it, and had apparently resumed once it had satisfied itself about the observation. I watched it move down the street and turn at the corner and be gone. I turned the light on and sat in the kitchen until 6 in the morning, and then I made coffee and went about my day. I've been in Vell for 4 months now. I observe the curfew the way the rest of the town observes it. Lights off, indoors. A practice that has become routine with the same speed that any practice becomes routine when you do it consistently enough. I leave the things I need to do outside until after 4 if they can wait, or do them before 2 if they can't. And in the window between, I'm in the house with the lights off and the window's not something I look out of. I had coffee with Orvine last month. Not an official visit, just coffee. The kind of thing that develops between people in small towns when they've had a formal interaction that went well, and there's no reason not to extend it into the ordinary social fabric. I told her I'd observed a curfew window. She received this without surprise and without the quality of someone who needed to ask follow-up questions. She said she'd assumed I would eventually, and that she was glad I'd done it from indoors. I asked her if the curfew actually kept them out, whether the ordinance had any genuine mechanism, or whether it was something the town observed and the presences observed in a parallel way for reasons of their own. She said she believed it was the latter, that the curfew was less a prohibition than a signal, the town's way of communicating a boundary that the presences had over a long period of negotiation she couldn't fully trace, agreed to respect during the 2-hour window. She said the window wasn't the town keeping the presences out. It was the town stepping back to let them through, and the 2 hours was the period both sides had settled on as sufficient for whatever transit the presences needed to make. I asked her if there was ever a violation, if the presences ever came through outside the curfew window. She said occasionally. She said those occasions were handled through the existing agreements rather than through anything the municipal code specified, and that the handling had always been sufficient. She said this with the same serenity she'd brought to all of it. 30 years of institutional knowledge arranged around an impossible fact, and I found that I understood her serenity better now than I had at the beginning of the conversation. Vell is a small and quiet town, and I can work from anywhere, and the house I rent is comfortable, and the people are good in the ways that people in small towns are good when the town has been well managed across generations. I have a 2-hour window in my overnight where I keep the lights off and stay inside, which is not a significant imposition once you've built it into your routine, and the rest of my life in Vell is the life I came here for. The Thursday night, I watch through the window. I keep mostly to myself, not because it frightened me beyond my capacity to process, though it did disturb me in ways I'm still accounting for 4 months later, but because Vell has a relationship with the non-resident presences that has taken generations to establish, and that works because everyone in the town understands their part in it, and the part involves a certain discipline about keeping the window, the darkness, the withdrawal from the streets. And I don't think adding the specific texture of what I saw that night to the general knowledge of someone who's been here 4 months serves anything. I'll keep the curfew. That's the agreement. That's always been the agreement. 2 to 4. Lights off inside. It's not complicated once you understand why. And now that I understand why, it's not even difficult. Most nights, it doesn't feel like anything at all.